Today, this webinar is an introduction to layers and masking, and I'm going to be using the photo suite as a standalone, which means that I'm not using a third-party application to work with my images. I have all of my photos open here inside Perfect Photo Suite 8, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to access them here. Many of the things that we're going to do in Perfect Layers today can be done if you start out using Aperture or Lightroom. Perfect Layers is not a plugin option for programs that already have layers, and that includes Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. But many of the same techniques that we're going to use today, the idea of how layers and masking works, that is going to be similar to the way that Photoshop and Photoshop Elements do work. So hopefully some of that information will transfer over if you're a Photoshop user, or if you're not and you really want to learn how to use the Photo Suite as a standalone, this is going to make a lot of sense and it's going to help you along your way. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's start out by grabbing an image, and I want to talk you through the basics of working with layers. Just going to scroll down to the bottom here, and I'm going to select my image, and we're going to click on layers in the top right-hand corner. Now, the number one thing when you're working with images is that you always want to create a copy of your original file. If you're working on raw images, which I am, you'll see the file ending of this is CR2, which means I use a Canon camera, and that is a raw file type. You can't edit your original raw files in the suite. It's not a raw processor. So it will automatically create that copy for you, which is really nice. But even if you aren't using raw files, it's best to create a copy. You never want to destroy your original image no matter what. And even though a layered workflow will give you a little bit more leeway, you still want to be very careful. Now, once I select edit a copy and I click OK, it's going to transfer that copied file over into Perfect Layers, and that's what we're going to be working with. Now, our image is open, and on the right-hand side of the screen in the layer stack, this is where you're going to find your image. This is a representation of your photo here in your layer stack, and you can see it kind of in the center of your screen. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen is something called the Files and Extras tabs, and these are actually going to be very important to understanding how layers work. This is how you can combine multiple images together to create a layer stack. So we're going to start out with something very basic. We're going to add a texture, and that'll be a good way to kind of walk you through how layers work. So I'm going to start out in my Extras tab, and these are all of the On1 extras that are included in the suite when you get it. It's underneath the On1 extras category. You can click this open, and you'll see that I can add backgrounds, which is what we're going to be doing later. You can add borders, and you can add textures. So we'll open up the textures category. There are multiple different types of textures we can apply. I'm just going to end up choosing one at random because I really want to, we're not going to keep this on this image. It's better to explain how all of this works using a texture. Now, you're going to see in the paper texture category, you'll get previews of what the textures are going to look like on your image. And there are lots of different paper-based textures. We're not going to go through and talk you through every single one of them. For now, I'm just going to choose one, and I want to add it to my photo. To add another layer to your image, while you're here inside Perfect Layers, just double-click what you'd like to apply. So I want to add Tattered Paper Blue. I'll double-click it. Now, the dialog that we just saw from Perfect Browse is going to pop up, and it's going to ask us whether we'd like to edit a copy of this texture. That's not what we want to do. We want to select the option down at the bottom, and it's Add as a Layer. That means that the photo that I have open here inside Perfect Layers, my New Zealand image here, I want to add this layer on top of it, or this texture on top of it. So I'll go ahead and choose that option. It's going to pull information from my image that I have open, so I don't need to readjust things like my copy options, and we're going to go ahead and click OK. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see that there are now two layers. On the top is our paper layer, and on the bottom is our photo layer. Whatever is on top is what you're going to be able to see on top. It's sometimes the best way to imagine the way that layers work is just the way that you would stack papers together. The piece of paper that's on the bottom of the stack, you won't be able to see if there are other papers stacked on top of it. If you cut a hole in the top piece of paper, you will be able to see the paper underneath it. And that's the basis of masking, is cutting holes through those papers or adjusting the transparency of the paper. So instead of having a solid white piece of paper on top, let's say you had a foggy piece of vellum. You'd still be able to see the piece of vellum, but you'd also be able to see a slight foggy version of the piece of paper underneath it. So if you ever have a hard time understanding the concept of layers, just take two pieces of paper and stack them on top of each other, and that's how layers work. And that sometimes will help you understand. Now, the layer stack, whatever is on top, is going to be what you are seeing. You can move these around just by clicking and dragging them. So we'll click and drag that texture layer underneath, and now I can't see it because my photo layer is on top of it. So let's click and drag that one more time. Now there are a couple of basic functions here when working with layers that are going to be really important. The first is the ability to duplicate a texture. So we're going to click on the duplicate layer in the bottom of my layer stack. And you have to make sure that whatever layer you have selected is the one you want to duplicate. And to select a layer, just click on it. And you'll see that it has a lighter gray around the one that you've chosen and a darker gray around the one that you do not have chosen. So we'll click on our texture and then click on duplicate layer. Now I have two of the exact same layer. You won't see a difference on your image because it duplicates it exactly where it is, and they look exactly the same. So there's going to be no change to our image, but now we have two different paper blue textures here inside our layer stack. If you want to delete a layer, there's a minus button down at the bottom of your layer stack. So we'll click on the minus button and it will remove whatever that top layer is. The last button down at the bottom is merge layer. And this is going to be really important when we combine this texture to our underlying image. And I'll talk to you about that in another moment here. Now, many times, especially when you're combining images together, so let's say we're going to add a sky to this later, or you add a texture like this image here, this texture does not fit very well with my image. It's square, and our photo is definitely not square. So we need to resize and rearrange this texture or this layer to refit it with our photo. On the left-hand side of the screen, there's something called the transform tool, and this gives you the ability to transform the dimensions of a layer to make it fit where you want it. So I'm going to choose the transform tool, and you'll get something called a bounding box, and that's what those little tiny squares around the edge of my texture are. That's the ability to resize and readjust this texture. Now you can just click and drag on these squares to be able to change the size of the texture. So we could make it thin, we could make it big. I can get it close to the edges. I can click and drag to move it around so it doesn't have to just be in the center. If I hold my mouse on the outside of the texture layer, outside of that bounding box, and I click and drag, I can actually rotate the texture as well. So if I don't want it to be a certain dimension, I could rotate it so that it is vertical instead of horizontal, or we can rotate it back so that it's horizontal again. Now, in many cases, when you're working with textures, you want it to just fit with your underlying image. And instead of having to go through and try and make sure that each side is working the way it should and line it up along the edges, that can be kind of annoying and it can take a little bit of time. Up in the top right-hand corner, when you have the transform tool chosen, there's something called the fill button. And this is one of the most useful tools when you're working with textures. It's a good way to understand how the transform tool works, but it's super useful with textures. When I click that button, it's going to go through and it is going to take my texture. It's going to take my texture and it's going to fill it with the layer underneath. So I'm going to go back to, this is what our original texture looks like. It's just a square. We haven't done anything to it. I want to make it fit with my underlying image. When I click fill, it's going to stretch the texture out and fit it perfectly with my photo. So now all those scratches from the edges of the texture are now pushed up to the edges of my underlying image. What's great about this is it means that we're not going to lose any of the texture. And because this is just a very basic kind of scratched paper texture, it's not going to be bad if I stretch it out. That's not going to be a problem at all. Now I'm going to click cancel one more time because I want to show you one last function when working with the transform tool, because this is going to be really useful if you're working with something other than textures. Now, this is a square, and let's say we need to keep it as a square. We can't stretch it out, and when we click and drag on the bounding box, just freehand, it's really hard to keep that square ratio and make it look right. I mean, we can kind of guesstimate, but that's really difficult. So we need to constrain the proportions of this texture so that it remains a square. So when I click and drag, instead of just clicking and dragging freehand, if you hold the Shift key on your keyboard and then you click and drag, doesn't matter where I bring my mouse, it will remain in the square format no matter how big or small I try and make this texture. So if you want to constrain the proportions and make sure that your layer doesn't get stretched out, you have to hold the Shift key. So we can make it quite a bit bigger, and then we can kind of move it into place. Now, if you are working with textures that are bigger or smaller than your photo, most of the time, even though our texture was probably about half the size of our original image, stretching it out is not going to affect the quality of the texture that much. If our texture was very, very, very small, so if we started out with something very tiny, you'll want to be careful about how big you make it. But because it started out at this nice big size, it's about half of our original photo, making it the size of our image is going to be just fine. So let's go ahead and let's fill this in. I'm going to click the fill button. The fill button does not constrain proportions. So when I click fill, it does stretch out my texture. That's very important to remember. If you want to constrain those proportions, you have to hold the Shift key. When you're done with the transform tool, go up to the tool options bar and click the apply button. We need to apply the changes that we just made. It's going to go through, it's going to save those, and now we have a brand new texture layer on top of our image. Now, back over in our layer stack, we need to go through and we need to blend our layers together. This obviously does not look very good. We cannot see the photo beneath it, so this is not exactly what I'm going for. There are two different ways that we can do that. The first is by accessing something called the layer opacity, and this is just the transparency of the layer. Right now it's at 100%, which means we can see 100% of our texture. By dropping the layer opacity down to the left, as I do so, the image beneath it is going to slowly reappear. Keep on moving it to the left, and then as I drop it down all the way to 0, the texture disappears. When we bring it back up, the texture will start to reappear all the way up to 100, and now the photo is gone again. So layer opacity is a really good way to blend two layers together, especially if there isn't much complicated about it. If we just want to drop down our layer opacity to about 20 or so we can still see the cracked texture, our photo is still underneath it, this is awesome. Maybe that's exactly what I wanted to do. Now, there are other ways that you can blend a texture and an underlying image together, and that's by using the blending drop-down menu. These are different types of blending modes that will change how two layers interact. Now, it is important to remember that the blending mode only affects the layer and the layer beneath it. So it's only going to affect our blue texture and the photo layer below it, only 2 layers. If there were 3 layers in our layer stack, it wouldn't touch the one on the very bottom. So the blending modes only interact with the layer you have chosen and the layer beneath it. Now, as long as I have my texture layer chosen, when I open up the blending drop-down menu, the best part about using this is the fact that when I hover my mouse over the image or over the different blending modes, it will show me a live preview of what it looks like. So there's some pretty weird and wild stuff that's happening here as we move it through. Now, the blending modes themselves, understanding how they work would take a lot longer, because if you take a look at how many different options are in here, it would take a very long time to explain what they're doing. But some of the basics. Overlay and soft light blend the 2 layers together and create this nice high contrast, high saturation look. In many cases, it can make your images look very, very contrasty and a little bit darker. There's also something called multiply, which will blend and darken. So this took the layer, and while it's adding a really cool effect to the sky, it's darkening our foreground a lot. The opposite of multiply is going to be screen. It's going to lighten and blend at the same time. So we can still see our photo. However, it's a lot brighter than we thought it was going to be. And as I scroll through, there are many, many others that you can play around with. It will be completely up to you which ones you think are going to work best for your photo. Most of the time, when working with textures, I see overlay and soft light as the 2 that most people use, but there are tons and tons and tons of other options here. Now, for now, I'm going to choose this one called Darken because it's doing a really cool thing on the sky, as is this one called Color Burn. So I can choose any of these. For now, I'm going to choose, let's actually select Linear Burn. That one's really, really fun. It's adding a super interesting effect to the sky here, which I really, really like. It's a little too intense, so I'm going to take the layer opacity and drop it down. So we'll move that over to the left, and we'll see that it's going to bring us a little bit back to our original photo. Now, in many cases, you're going to end up applying something that you only want to add to part of your photo. This texture looks great on the sky. It's bringing back a lot more of the cloudiness and moodiness of the sky. However, it really darkened the foreground of our photo. So those rocks right here, this place is called the Elephant Rocks. It's in the lower island of New Zealand, and I spent quite a bit of time around here. Some of the Chronicles of Narnia movies were filmed here, if you ever recognize that. If you have kids who watch those, you may recognize it. But the elephant rocks down at the bottom are really dark. But in our original photo, they were a lot brighter. Now, back in your layer stack, you'll notice that there are eye icons next to each one of the layers. These indicate whether the layers are visible or whether you can see them at any given moment. What's great about the eye icons is instead of deleting a layer and then having to add it back in, you can just turn the eye icon off to hide a layer. So now we can take a look at our original photo. We can see, the bottom of our image looks pretty nice, and I can see all this great detail and all that color in the grass. But when I turn my texture layer back on, it's basically been eradicated. So we want to remove the texture from the bottom half of our photo. Now, that is when masking comes into hand. And masking is a way for us to selectively choose which layers are visible and which layers are not, and which parts of our photo we want to be visible and which parts we do not. Masking is mostly controlled by something called the masking brush. And the masking brush tool works just like any other brush that you may have used before. I'm going to select it on the left-hand side of the screen, and I'm going to hover my mouse over my image, and you'll see that you get a circle. This is our brush tool. And then up in the tool options bar, we can make changes to the brush itself. Now, one of the most important is going to be your mode. It's on the top left-hand corner, and there are 2 options, paint out or paint in. This is whether you are painting out or removing a layer, which is what we're going to choose, or whether you're painting it back in if you make a mistake. We're going to choose paint out because we need to remove the texture from the rocks and the grass. You can also change the size of your brush. Right now it's a little small, so maybe I'll take the size and move that over to the right. And now my brush is bigger. There's also feathering amount, which is very important. This is the softness of the edge of the brush. So if I drop the feathering all the way down to 0 and I drag through, you'll see that the edge of the brush is very harsh. If I push the feathering up all the way to 100 and I draw right next to it, you can see that the edge of the brush is very soft. This will be completely dependent on what type of mask you're creating. Some you're going to want a hard-edged brush, others you're going to want to make very soft, subtle masks, so you can play around with feathering and see what's going to work best for your image. Now, the last option is opacity, and opacity is very important. When we click and drag and remove a section, so we got rid of this whole line right here, it removed it 100%. It's gone. That area right there is back to our original image. The opacity is just the transparency of the brush, and it's similar to layer opacity. So if I drop this down to, let's say, 30 or 40, and then we click and drag, you'll see it's removing a little bit, but it's not removing all of it, not all at the same time. What's great about this is you can build up areas that you want to remove more, and then areas that you want to remove less. So we could go through and remove more at the bottom of this area, but there's less being removed up in the sky. So layer opacity can be very useful, again, depending on what type of mask you're creating. The last option here is going to be our perfect brush, and this is our edge detection tool. And we'll be talking about this a little bit later, but for now I'm just going to leave it off. I'm going to go up to my feathering amount, and we're going to drop that down. It's a little high. And there we go. Now, to remove a section of your image, just click and drag over that part of the photo, and you'll see the texture layer is being masked out or removed, and our underlying image is reappearing. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time making this mask look very nice, so I'm going to go through really quickly because I want to show you a couple of other things with your brush tool. So we're going through and we make this mask. Oh no, we make a couple of mistakes. We've gone through and we went overboard along the edge of the rocks. We accidentally weren't paying attention and we clicked through and made a couple of brush strokes in the sky. All these different mistakes. There are a couple different ways that you can go through and adjust mistakes. The first is just by going up to the Edit menu and scrolling down to Undo. The keyboard shortcut for that is Control or Command Z. That will undo a brush stroke. You can also press it on your keyboard and you'll see it removes multiple different brush strokes all at the same time. So one right after the other, it's going to keep on removing until you stop. Now let's say that you made a couple of brush strokes, but then you made a couple of really good brush strokes and you don't want to have to undo everything that you've just done. A lot of times those accidents happen as you're going through and creating a mask, and you don't want to have to undo the whole thing and start again from scratch. You can also go back up and change your mode from paint out, or removing the texture, to paint in. We want to choose paint in, and then we can click and drag, and we can go through and we can paint back in the texture where we want it to be. So we'll click and we'll drag, and let's say we want our texture back on part of our photo. We'll go through and we're creating this mask really quickly. Now this is all freehand, so I'm doing this on a mouse. I don't have my Wacom tablet logged in. Most of the time, if I have my Wacom tablet, I'll be a little bit more exact, and it's something that I highly recommend if you're going to be doing a lot of masking. Tablets are a way for you to basically draw on your computer, and they're very useful in situations like this because you and your finger on the keyboard can get a little difficult sometimes. So if you have a tablet, whip it out for this kind of thing. If your friend has a tablet, ask to borrow it very kindly, or invest in some of the Wacoms. There are lots of different versions of them, and the cheaper ones are still absolutely amazing. I have two, one that I've had for about 7 years, and it still works. So they're a really, really good investment. Now, on our mask, there are a couple of other functions that come with your mask that are important to note. When you have your brush tool selected on the left-hand side, in the top right-hand corner of the tool options bar, there are two buttons. The first is invert. That will switch the area of the texture that you can see with the area that you removed the texture from. This is really, really useful when you're making small, intricate masks. But let's click the invert button and I'll show you how it works. So it's going to swap the top and the bottom of this texture layer. So when I click it, all of a sudden, the top part of our photo is fine and the bottom part has been darkened by the texture. And we can click this again to swap it back. The other option here is reset. If you make a lot of mistakes and you've gone through and your mask looks really bad, and this is not at all what you were going for, if you want to just start again from scratch instead of having to undo multiple different times for multiple different brush strokes, just click the reset button. That is going to go through and reset your mask. You're back at just your texture layer being applied to your underlying photo layer, and now I can go through and I can paint back in something a little bit more intricate. So maybe I plug in my Wacom tablet, things are going to look a little bit better. I use my perfect brush, any of those other options where I kind of want to just start again from scratch. So we can go back through and we can repaint our mask in, and maybe that's looking a little bit better because we took a little bit of extra time. So the reset button is very, very useful. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to reset this one more time. And I'm going to go through and give you kind of a practical example for using these techniques for a photo like this one here. This is not the kind of image that I really want to apply a texture to, so I want to walk you through how to replace a very basic sky. And this is something that I think a lot of people do on a very regular basis, and this will show off all the different things that we've just learned. So I'm going to go over to my layer stack, and I'm going to delete my paper layer. If for some reason I want to leave it there, that's actually not a problem at all. So I'm going to swap my blending mode back to normal here. We're going to raise the layer opacity. If I think I might want to use this texture, instead of deleting it, I can just click and drag it to the bottom of my layer stack and maybe hide it by clicking the eye icon, and I'll use it a little bit later. So instead of having to reapply it in a bit, we'll just leave it where it is. Maybe I'll use it later, maybe I won't. Instead of deleting it and having to start again from scratch, I'll just put it down at the bottom and hide it. Now, what we need to do is apply a new sky. And there are quite a few backgrounds in the On One Extras category. So we'll choose backgrounds and you'll see skies. There's a whole category of different skies here. Do pay attention to the light in the skies. There are some that are not going to work quite as well as others, and that's just because of the direction of the light. There are also some that are tilted in a certain way, so you want to be careful at where that tilt is going to be. It's completely up to you where you want, what type of sky you're looking for. Maybe for this image, I would want to play around with a cloudier sky because obviously this day was cloudier, and I can add effects to my image to make it look a little bit more unified, but a cloudy sky might work really well. The other thing that I want to mention is that you also have something called user extras, and we haven't introduced that yet. But user extras are backgrounds, borders, and textures that you import yourself. I've created a whole bunch of each one of these different categories, and I include them in my version of the suite, and I import them. Many of my backgrounds and textures you guys may have gotten through the loyalty rewards program that we have here at On One, so you may recognize some of these, but it's actually a really, really useful tool because if you don't like the backgrounds that we have, the On One extras, just import your own backgrounds And if you have a question about how to do that, just jump over to the training site. There's a great video all about working with and importing extras. But I'm going to open up my Liz's backgrounds category. And we're going to scroll through until we find one that we like. Now, there are quite a few, but one of my favorite down here at the bottom, I've got two versions, one that's a little bit more purple, one that's a little bit more blue, which is really nice. So I can choose which color option I like best. I think that's fun. So let's choose the blue option here. I like that a little bit better. I'm going to double click it. I'm going to choose the option to add as a layer and click OK. Now, just like we saw before, we need to resize this layer because it is obviously not fitting very well. So I'm going to choose my transform tool and I'm going to click and drag. I'm not too worried about this stretching out. So I'll stretch it out just a little bit, not too much. I can resituate it depending on where I want the top and the bottom of the sky to be. So maybe I don't want that horizon line exactly where the edge of the horizon for this image is. So maybe I'll drop it down just a little bit. That's going to be up to you and how your editing works. This looks pretty good, so I'll apply the changes that I made. Now, this layer is obviously on top of my background photo, and that's not where it needs to be. So in my layer stack, I'm going to click and drag it underneath my photo layer. Now when I turn the eye icon on and off of my photo layer, you'll be able to see my background. Now, one of the things that you may notice is that there's this weird checkered background on the bottom part of my sky layer. This is just a transparent background. Instead of making it white, which can sometimes be confusing, there's this white and gray checkered backdrop that is used for transparency. So this is not going to be applied to your image if you mask out part of it. This does not appear ever anywhere, no matter what type of layering you're working on. This just indicates transparency. That's all it does. So there isn't any part of the sky layer that's down here on the little bottom section of our photo. So it's transparent for now. So don't freak out if you see this. That's all that means. Now what we need to do is we need to remove boring sky, which is very, very boring. So we're going to go over to our masking brush tool. And we're going to make sure our mode is set to paint out. And we'll just start by clicking and dragging with our masking brush to remove and mask out the boring sky. Now you'll see that I'm not getting that close to the edges. And this is going to be a great instance where we need to use the perfect brush. So we're going to get pretty close up to the edge, as close as we can get. Not so close, because we don't want to go through and mess up. If we mess up, it's going to look really bad. So I'll press Control and Controller Command Z to undo a change that I made. And then I'm going to go up, and this time we're going to use the perfect brush. Now the way that it works is based on color information. So it looks at the color underneath the center of the brush, which is what that little minus sign is in the middle of the brush circle. It pays attention to color information underneath the center of the brush and only removes that specific color. Now, if there are colors that are very similar, it will have a very hard time differentiating. So if we wanted to remove, for instance, the rocks from each other, I may need to use a much more intricate option. The perfect brush works best if there's color differentiation. So we want to make sure that the colors are different from the foreground than the background. Now, let's go ahead and I'm going to click and drag this along the edge of my rocks. Because that sky is different than my mountain, it's creating a really, really nice edge between my foreground and my background. And we're just going to click and drag across the entire edge of our image. We need to get rid of all of that excess sky so that this will blend together. And there we go. Now that looks pretty darn good. And this was a really boring sky. I shot this on purpose so the sky would be a little bit brighter. So this blended really well. If you have any problems with the perfect brush, don't forget that you can swap your mode. So let's say it accidentally went overboard somewhere and it ate into something that you don't want. You can always jump back up to your mode menu and swap it from paint out to paint in. We need to paint back in our photo layer. So we'll click and we'll drag over the spot that we want to bring back. And you can use this anywhere. So maybe it created or moved something around the edge of part of your photo. You need to go back through and paint that back in. And one of the last things that's going to be really useful when you're working with masking here inside of Perfect Layers is going to be the ability to take a look at what your mask actually is, what it looks like. In your layers stack on the right-hand side, you'll see next to my photo layer, which is on top, that's what we've been masking. We've been masking out the sky. There's a little thumbnail, and it's black and white. There's a really good rule of thumb for understanding how masks look and how they work. It's white reveals, black conceals. White reveals the layer the way that it is. Black conceals the layer so that we can't see it. You can take a look at the representation of your mask a little bit bigger by going down to the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. There's a mask view mode, and right now, kind of circling my mouse around it, kind of pointing at it down at the bottom, it's very small, so I apologize if it's hard to see, but it's right here. It says all layers right now, which means that we're taking a look at all of our layers sandwiched together into one. And we've got our sky, we've got our foreground layer, it looks great. If we open this up, I can view my mask in a couple of different ways. And this just helps a lot when you're working on very particular, very specific masks. So my favorite option is called Mask Red, and I'll go ahead and choose that. Anywhere on my image that is red, we can't see this layer. So we removed the boring sky, and that's why the top half of our image now is red. Anywhere that you can see your photo clearly, like we can down here, it means that we haven't masked it out yet. Now, what's great about this is there are a couple of weird little pockets in the sky that we accidentally missed, and that's really, really nice. So I can go through and I can make sure I clean up those tiny, tiny little pockets so that my mask is really exact. So there was a little hole down at the bottom there I missed by accident, maybe down there. Got to make sure we get all those nice edges around the edge of this giant rock right in the center. So we want to go through and do that. And because we can take a look at this mask view, it helps us be more exact. Sometimes when you're just looking at the foreground and the background combined together, you don't always see those little imperfections. But those imperfections sometimes can be very revealing of how much attention you paid to your mask. So viewing it like this can be very helpful. There are a couple of other options down here that you can choose from in your mask view menu. One of the most popular is mask white or mask dark as well. So when I choose mask white, the sky is now white. It has a white overlay on it. Mask dark has a dark gray overlay. And again, it's another good way to see imperfections that you may have missed. And then the last one is mask grayscale. This is just a black and white representation of what your layer mask looks like. So that's all. But again, lots of different ways to see representations of your mask to make sure that you're making the kind of changes that you want. Now let's go back and let's swap this to all layers so that we can see our layers together. The last and most important thing about working with layers here is going to be how you edit this photo. The foreground and the background both need a little bit of work to look unified because right now it looks very disjointed. One of the great things about working with layers is the fact that because the foreground are rocks and grass and our background, the sky that we added in, are separated, it means that we can edit them separately. And I personally think that this is the coolest part about working with layers. It can completely change the way your photos look. It is very important that they remain on separate layers. So we're going to make sure that we choose our top layer. This is going to be our foreground or our rocks. Our background is still on our separate layer. So let's say we want to take this into a different program. I'm going to choose my top layer, and I'm going to take it into Enhance. So we'll click on Enhance. It's going to prep our image. It's still going to look just the way that we saw it in perfect layers, so you shouldn't see a change here. It's got our background and our foreground. But what's really cool here is I'm going to go over to the Color and Tone Adjustments pane, and I'm going to use the Brightness slider to lighten up the foreground. When I do so, no matter how light or dark I play around with this layer, it's only affecting the bottom. Because we worked on these layers separately, our foreground and our background are different, and they're still separated in our layer stack, I can now lighten up the bottom half of my photo individually. And when you are working on an image like this, where you have a foreground and a background that are not 100% joined yet, they don't look like they're meshing very well yet, editing them differently is going to help. So we can brighten up the foreground. Let's add a little bit of detail to crisp up all those edges. Maybe play around with the contrast a little bit so that we can have a really nice, really bright photo. We can add some vibrance in here. We can adjust the temperature, so maybe we'll cool it down a couple of points. Or if we want to, we could warm it up. So we'll go through and play around with those. We can go in and we'll add some contrast. And that's looking pretty good. Now, when you do make changes to individual layers, there's something really interesting that happens. So we adjusted the foreground. You can take a look at our preview there. This is what we started out with. This is what we ended up with. A really nice difference between the two. When we click Apply at the bottom right-hand corner of Enhance, and it adds all these different effects to our image, it's going to take us back into layers, and it's going to do something really, really cool. I think this is super cool. It adds a separate layer. So now you should see 4 layers in my layer stack. The top one is called Enhance. Underneath is my photo layer, the one that we originally started with. And then down here is going to be my background sky. And down at the bottom, we still have our tattered paper blue texture layer. It's still there. It's just hidden. What's great about this is it adds all of the edits that we made inside Perfect Enhance to a separate layer so that just in case we make a mistake, we can always go back to our original photo layer. So let's turn our Perfect Enhance layer off for a second. Original photo is still there. What's great is I can just hide this layer just by clicking the eye icon. And now I can keep it there. If I need it, I can use it. But if not, I'm just going to keep it hidden so I don't have to worry about it. And we can do the exact same thing with all of the layers in our layer stack. So let's choose the sky layer and we'll bring it into Enhance and we'll make an adjustment to it. So let's say we want to make it a little bit darker, maybe adjust the temperature so it's still a little too, maybe it's a little too blue or a little too warm. We can adjust that. So I'm going to make it a little bit bluer and maybe a little bit greener so it's got more of an aqua tint to it. I'll add a little bit of darkness with the blacks, maybe add a little bit of detail, and click Apply. It's going to do the exact same thing. We'll have our original background layer that we brought in from our extras category, and then on top is our new edited sky layer. Now, the last little thing that I'm going to talk to you about is what happens when you have layers and you want to join them together. There are 2 very important functions here. The first is merge layer, and I'll show you how that works. Now, it's very important that merge layer only works with 2 layers at a time, and it only works with 2 layers where the eye icons are both open. So both of your layers need to be in view at the same time, one on top of the other. So let's say we want to merge our edited rocks photo with the really, really bad dark one beneath it. We want to merge these 2 together because I'm never going to want to go back to my original photo. Never. It was really bad. It was so dark. So I'm just going to merge these. So I'm going to go down to my layer stack down at the bottom. I'm going to select my top photo layer that says enhance. Underneath is my original photo layer, the one that says NZ for New Zealand. And when I click on merge layer, it's going to go through, it's going to merge those two together. Now, what's important about that is when you do merge them, your mask will disappear. So now it's just no mask. It's just gone through and it's removed the top half of the photo. Now, if you don't want to do this, if you want to save your mask so that you can always go back and undo it, I'm going to undo that change there. I suggest you don't merge your layers. There's another function in here that's really cool. I'm going to go up to the layer menu at the top of my screen. You'll see that there's merge layers. Merge visible will merge every single visible layer in your layer stack. We don't want to do that either. The last option is something called new stamped layer. Now it's very important that when you use this, that you go up and you make sure that the layers that you don't want to be seen are turned off. So we're going to turn off all of our original layers. We're going to turn off our texture layer, and that you have your top layer chosen. So right now I have my top photo layer selected. Go up to the layer menu and choose new stamped layer. What it does is it merges all of the layers that you have shown together into one unified photo layer. Now, what's great about this is I can now add a universal photo effect to my entire image. So if I take this back into Enhance, this brand new layer that we just created, and I do something like adjust the brightness, it adjusts the entire photo. So now it's universal. I have everything all together. I can go in and add more contrast. I can add something like a vignette, which should only be added to an image that is combined, like this one here. I can make an overall temperature adjustment if I want to warm the entire photo up, anything along those lines. And because it's unified, I now can work on the entire image. So you have the option of working on separate layers, and each one individually with all your individual masks that you created. And then by using new stamped layer, you can create a brand new one to do all of your adjustments on at once. Now, this is a lot of layers, and this is a lot of layers that I want to make adjustments that I may not want to make adjustments to. I may be done with. So one of the things that I do suggest is if you are working on an image and you make adjustments to a layer, like I'm going to hide everything. Our original background. I don't need this layer. So to save a little bit of space on my hard drive, I'm just going to go back and remove my original layer. Don't need it. Let's say that I realize I don't want to add a texture. I'm going to go through and I'm going to delete that texture. I have my original stamped layer here, which we can take a look at. That's just the one that we didn't add the vignette to. I don't necessarily need that, so I can go through and remove it if I want to. I can always merge these back together at another time. The layers that I do suggest you keep are the ones that you spend a lot of time working on with masks. Those you should probably keep in your layer stack because it's going to help you make sure that you don't eradicate any changes that you really wanted to be able to go back and readjust later. But now I've cleaned up my layer stack. I removed all the excess, all the fat that I didn't want there, and I have a really nice clean workflow that shows how I got from point A to point B.